Very good evening. You're watching the Free Press Journal live on YouTube. I'm Afrida Rahman Ali. Prime Minister Modi promised retribution for the attack on Indian citizens in Pahalgam. In fact, sent a tough message as well, saying that India will identify, track, and punish every terrorist and their backers and will pursue them to the ends of the earth. What we saw happening so far is an important CCS meeting on the 23rd of April itself, where the Prime Minister, again after that meeting, assured that the forces, the defense forces, have been given full freedom, full operational freedom given to them. We were also told that a number of diplomatic measures have been taken, chief among them being to hold the Indus Water Treaty, to downgrade diplomatic relations with Pakistan, reduce the mission strength, expel diplomats, cancel visas, all of this, even shut the Atari Wagah border, withdraw its own advisors and staff from Indian mission in Islamabad. All of that is being done. But now we are at a situation where the discussion is around our military preparedness. To discuss about this aspect, I have with me today Commodore Uday Bhaskar, who is a distinguished former naval officer. He's joining us live at the moment. Good evening, Commodore Bhaskar. Welcome to Free Journal. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
So let's begin with this question on military preparedness. And as we all know, the Prime Minister met with the Chief of Defence Staff and individually met the Air Force Chief and the Navy Chief as well. This is giving an indication that the matter is being taken seriously at the highest level, and there are strategies that are being worked out. What, according to you, should be India's next step?
India will pursue what I would describe as a calibrated approach in terms of how it frames its response to the Pahalgam terror attack. As you have pointed out in your preliminary remarks, there are a range of options that India has. These span the political, the economic, trade, water, and the military. You can see that I'm deliberately listing the military option as the very last. And clearly, Prime Minister Modi and his team have sent out a signal of both resolve, which is to assuage the domestic sentiment that the perpetrators of this dastardly attack will be pursued, will be identified, will be apprehended and punished. And also, and I think that is the subtext that is important in relation to the state sponsorship of terrorism, that the handlers will also be dealt with in a manner that India deems appropriate. So it's in that context that the first three steps have been taken at the political, economic, and for the first time, water has been brought onto the table, but again in a very measured way. Now, yes, the last of the options is the military option. And towards that end, again, I would say that there is some very measured signaling that is going on, which is the fact that the Prime Minister has given the military commanders a directive. This will not be devoid of or separated from the larger political objective, because any military initiative is an extension of the larger political message that is being sought to be conveyed. But the very fact that this has been highlighted in the media, that the Prime Minister has met the service chiefs individually. We are aware that he has met the naval chief, as also the air chief, and earlier the CDS. And this whole sequence, I think, is indicative of a measured response. What exactly will happen, I think, is in the tactical realm. And perhaps one should not speculate on that part. But as an analyst, I would interpret this as a message of resolve and restraint, that India is not trying to escalate in any impulsive manner.
Yeah, and that is what is being said as a very matured response as well. India wants to be seen as a country that is responsible. The initial response across international media has been reported as one that is measured and, as you said, very apt as well. India wants to be resolute and relentless in its action, but yes, there should not be any knee-jerk reaction that could in any way backfire. But tell me, with the Prime Minister making it very clear that the armed forces have complete operational freedom, and I'm putting it out there on screen as well, to decide on the mode, targets, and timing of our response. So, is this an attempt to actually balance things? Because out there we know the Pakistan army operates on its own. It does not really report to a political master like the Indian armed forces do. So, was this imperative that the first thing to do is just put it out there that the army has the full freedom? It can do what it deems fit.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of clarity in the way in which Prime Minister Modi has signaled what he proposes to do in terms of the response. Now, I think this is an important point that you have raised, that in the case of Pakistan, it is often said that the army is the real power in that country. And
Yeah.
whereas most countries, democratic countries particularly, have armies that are mandated to carry out the political task. A country has an army. In the case of Pakistan, it is an army that has more or less
Yeah.
intimidated and subsumed the entire apparatus of state and governance. So, therefore, we know from the Kargil experience of 1999 that the then Army Chief General Parvez Musharraf had carried out a plan without keeping the civilian leadership in the loop. And this was corroborated later by Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif. So, to that extent, there is a template in which the Pakistani army in particular operates. Here in India, it is a very, very credible, mature, established democracy since August 1947. And the signal this time around is that post Pahalgam, there will be a response, but it will not be an impulsive response, because a lot of speculation has been doing the rounds both in the Indian media, particularly in Pakistan, that will there be the equivalent of a Balakot plus. If you recall, in 2019, post Pulwama, we had Balakot. So this was the kind of speculation. So I think now, with the passage of time, we can see that the Indian response is going to be more measured. And the fact that this particular statement that the Prime Minister has already made, that the armed forces have been given a free hand, would suggest that they will act at a time and place of their own choosing within the larger framework of what the country wants to do post Pahalgam.
Yeah. You've used these words repeatedly: measured response, calibrated response, and also, of course, it is not a matter that probably the government wants to put in public domain. And we media houses have already received an advisory to exercise restraint in our reportage as well on whatever is the military movements. And we are, of course, going to follow that very carefully. I want to ask you this question about uh, what is the kind of caution that you would recommend as a defense expert? Because Pakistan, being a failed nation, being a reckless nation, being a nuclear power, is there a boundary? Is there a sort of a template that we have to follow in dealing with a country like Pakistan, especially when all sorts of statements, belligerence that we hear from the other side of the border on what they can do, even to the point of the Indus Water Treaty. What is the caution? What is the word of caution that you have?
Well, again, based on my own personal experience of studying Pakistan's behavior for almost 30 years, because this pattern of state sponsored terrorism begins in a very definitive manner from the early 90s. I would link this with the time when Prime Minister Narasimha Rao was in the chair, and the entire South Asian region was dealing with the equivalent of a blowback after the
Yeah.
Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan. Then to now, we have a number of distinctive experiences that India has had in relation to Pakistan and this form of terrorism. Kargil 1999 is one example, and Mumbai 2008 is the other which comes to mind. And if you go forward, we have Pulwama Balakot of 2019. So I think the caution for India, or the framework in terms of how we should respond, I think is to try and get a sense about the objective of the adversary. Now here we have two sets of adversaries, if I may put it that way. One is at the tactical level, the perpetrators of the attack in Pahalgam on April 22nd. The fact that they killed the tourists in a very indiscriminate way. This is almost a repeat of Hamas and what happened on October 7th at one level, that you attack innocent tourists. The second level in terms of the adversary is what Prime Minister Modi and the Indian security apex has described as the handlers, those who are providing the support and the planning for carrying out such attacks against India. Clearly, this points to groups which are operating from within Pakistan. The Lashkar-e-Taiba has already been identified in the preliminary report of the NIA, the National Investigating Agency. So if I were to reconstruct and say what are the objectives, the tactical objective of the perpetrators was to kill. And that has been achieved, which is a great tragedy, and India has taken note of that. But beyond that, I would say that perhaps yet another objective is to create a certain amount of discord in India in terms of the domestic polity. One, to, in a way, counter the kind of objective of the Indian government, particularly of the Modi government after the abrogation of Article 370, that a certain degree of normalcy is returning to Kashmir. One of the indicators has been the tourist traffic in Kashmir, and that is something that has been disrupted. So this is one of the objectives as I reconstruct it. The other is, I think the larger one, if you remember, there was reference to the identity, the religious identity of the victims. And this was constantly played up in the first few days, that Hindus were taken out separately and they were shot dead and so on. Now that, to my mind, is an attempt to try and play the religious card within the domestic context of India. And I believe that India has dealt with that in a very mature way. Our political leadership across party lines has stood together and said that they would not let this kind of a religious card be played. And by and large, barring, I think, the exceptions that you see on social media, the fringe, I would say that this has been a very good response by India, a mature response to prevent this kind of domestic discord from being stoked. If these two objectives, I think, are identified, I think India can then operate within that template, which is to say that at the tactical level, I'm sure our investigative agencies are already pursuing the terrorists who carried out this attack. There are preliminary reports to say that some people have been identified by name and in terms of where they came from and so on, and perhaps the net will close and very soon they would be brought to book. Once that is done, I think India is going to then take the next step, which is to deal with the handlers. And all of this is being done, again, I use the same two words, in a measured manner, with the signal that it is not India's intent to escalate, that we have a simple kind of objective, which is to bring the terrorists to book. And this is something that Prime Minister Modi has been saying since his first term, that when India is subjected to this kind of terrorism, the government of the day will respond in a very, very resolute manner, which of course every Prime Minister in India has attempted in his or her own way. And I think we are seeing now the 2025 version of what India is having to deal with after the Pulwama Balakot experience. Afrida?
Yes. Commodore Bhaskar, I'm now going to be the devil's advocate for a bit and tell you Pakistan's point of view. And of course, many of us have heard their defense minister, their army chief. I've also heard their former national security advisor and the various interviews where they are talking about how India has not given any evidence of Pakistan being behind this. And international media, in fact, there was a New York Times report saying there is inadequate evidence at this point to suggest that Pakistan could be behind this. If there is any, then that should, because why we need that is in order to elicit any sort of international support. Again, the onus comes on us to provide credible evidence. How do we get that? And can we, without eliciting, without getting the sort of solid support of the allies, from the international community, take unilateral action, or we should wait and then gather our forces and then make a move which will make it more effective?
There are two tracks here, Afrida. This is a fair observation that India should put together, find the evidence that is credible, and that could point the finger towards groups or even the Pakistani agency, the deep state as it is called. But let me just remind you and all those who are watching this program that if you look at Pakistan's own track record, going back to Kargil in 1999, the first response was that the Pakistani military, the army, is not involved. We know that in subsequent weeks, the Pakistani military was identified as coming there without their uniforms and trying to be there in civilian dress and pretend to be the equivalent of militant/terrorists. But they were exposed, and I think the clinching evidence was that phone call between General Musharraf and his CGS at that time, which was played out in the international arena. Fast forward to Mumbai, 2008, 26/11. The first response was that Pakistan is not involved. And then, to the credit of the Pakistani media, it was media outlets in Pakistan that tracked Kasab and found his identity and made that
Yeah.
public. And then very shamefacedly, the Pakistani government had acknowledged that yes, Kasab was from Pakistan. So to that extent, I think Pakistan's own credibility is rather shaky when it comes to the kind of track record it has on terrorism. This
Yeah.
time around, my sense again is that with the NIA having taken over the case, that they would put together the evidence and India will share it, as it has in the past, with select interlocutors from the global community. And where necessary, it will make it, I'm sure, available to the public also, but it doesn't have to. Because when it comes to terrorism, there are a lot of areas that are relatively grey. And any country, particularly India, I think does not need the equivalent of an international nod or any kind of approval, because this is the right to defense. Meaning every country has a right to defend itself even under the UN Charter. And in that context, I think India can take steps that would be deemed to be unilateral if it is operating within the framework that it has set for itself. India is a democratic country, it has certain principles it adheres to, and the response would be, my sense is, proportionate to the scale of the terror that was unleashed in Pahalgam. Afrida?
Yeah. Can I take you back to that moment? Because obviously there is anger for what happened, but there is also quite a bit of anger, or I would say disappointment, with the fact that there seems to be a huge intelligence failure, because this entire area was unguarded, it was a tourist spot, and the presence of the forces from the accounts of the victims was not there. So would you say that, that complacency that Kashmir is now peaceful and there is no cross-border terrorism also cost us heavily, at least from what this incident indicates?
Yeah, I think I'll pick up two words from what you have just said: complacency and perhaps a kind of wishful thinking that normalcy had returned to Kashmir. I think both these are issues that need to be reviewed. But I'd like to make a larger institutional kind of observation, which is that number one, whenever there is a terrorist attack that is deemed to be major or massive, it happens because there is a lapse. This is a tenet that is cast in stone. I don't think we can shy away from that. Now, for just to recall, when 9/11 happened in the United States, 2001 September, it was a lapse. It was a very major lapse that led to the kind of trauma and tragedy that the United States had experienced at that time. Similarly, the Indian case also, or for that matter, even as far as Israel is concerned, on October 7th, there was a lapse, which is why October 7th happened. In like fashion, Pulwama happened in 2019 because there was a lapse. Mumbai 26/11 happened because there was a lapse. Similarly, Pahalgam, the 22nd April attack happened because there was a lapse. And I think here, I would like to go back to 1999 and the Kargil War, when Prime Minister Vajpayee was at the helm of affairs in India. And soon after the Kargil War, you may recall, he set up something called the Kargil Review Committee. And that was chaired by India's strategic doyen, Mr. K. Subramaniam, the late Mr. K. Subramaniam, who incidentally is the father of our Foreign Minister, Dr. Jaishankar. And this particular Kargil Review Committee had eminent experts from the military, the civilian world, diplomats, and so on. And the findings of the Kargil Review Committee were placed in the public domain. Some parts were redacted, but a large amount was placed in Parliament and the public was informed. And one of the central observations was related to the intelligence domain. And at that time, the report said that there is no adequate intelligence gathering, sharing, and analysis in India, and that the various agencies are operating in a manner that is perhaps not optimum. Words to that effect, and recommended a review and a rewiring. I say this with a lot of sadness, Afrida, that from 2000, when Mr. Bajpayee was Prime Minister, to where we are now in the third term of Mr. Modi, with very senior people from the intelligence establishment, like our National Security Advisor, Mr. Ajit Doval, having been there at the very top, there is no political resolve to carry out this intelligence review and dot the I's, cross the T's, and have an appropriate kind of structure. And Kashmir is, I think, the best example because, as you are well aware, I'm sure many of our viewers would know, there are levels and levels at which the intelligence is gathered. I mean, there is the Kashmir police, for instance, the J&K police, the erstwhile J&K, now in the Union Territory of Kashmir. Separately, you have the paramilitary, which is the equivalent of the BSF and the CRPF, wherever they are located.
Yeah.
LoC.
Hmm.
And over and above that, you have the intelligence agencies, which is the IB, the Intelligence Bureau, and the R&AW, which is the external agency, the Research and Analysis. And then we have more recently formed organizations like the NPRO, which is technical research, and there are other, I would say, inputs that the system gets. So there is a need clearly to have a better appreciation of both intelligence collection and intelligence synthesis and analysis. Now, recently I read some reports in the media which seem to suggest that some inputs were perhaps received, but the location was not very clear, and they come back to the same thing, saying that the intelligence provided was not actionable. The same thing was said after 26/11 in Mumbai. So, as an analyst, I'm saying that we fully accept that it is a challenge for any democracy, particularly for a country like India, which has this kind of a history, a topography, a geography, the geopolitics of Pakistan, of China, to have the equivalent of 100% surveillance. It is not possible. It needs the kind of
It
physical.
is not possible, Commodore Bhaskar, also because now, as it turns out, and there is this new acronym called OWG, Overground Worker, OGW, sorry, Overground Worker. And we've seen reports now of how there is this entire local network set up. So if you have that sort of a support base, how much can the armed forces do? Do you feel that somewhere the armed forces and the synergy with the local people, which is perhaps in this, something that you can't do without in a place like Jammu and Kashmir, is where the government has failed to create that level of mistrust with the armed forces perhaps is still there, that you have local elements forming these OGWs that I'm now hearing of. And as it turns out, they would obviously alert the terrorists of where the gaps are. And how do you then do a foolproof intelligence
You
mapping,
know,
as you Hmm.
this is that if you review terrorism, the kind of low intensity conflict, internal security challenges that J&K particularly has been experiencing, as I said, since the early 90s, I think we have to be careful in terms of how we proceed in terms of the correlation between the civilian population and the armed forces. Because, I repeat this, and give me a moment or two to explain this, that in a
Sure.
democracy, the military has a very well defined role, that is to defend the border against the external enemy. That is the primary responsibility, to ensure territorial integrity. And in the event there is an escalation, that the Indian military, like any other military, is mandated as per the constitution to use macro force, which means that you destroy, they will be killing, and all of that is as per the law and is something that the military is mandated to do against an external adversary. It becomes very complex when the army, in particular, is drawn into internal security duties. The jargon word is IS. That yes, India's own track record from August 1947 to where we are now, there have been a number of instances where the Indian military, particularly the army, has been drawn into the LIC-IS kind of tasking, low intensity conflict and internal security, particularly in J&K. Now, once you bring the army in, then the layers through which the civilian population interacts, first of all, is the local police. They are a very, very important layer. So when you talk about the overground worker, the fact that there could be some informers within the civilian population, I would say that the primary responsibility devolves or rests upon the local police, and they would be supported by the intelligence agencies. There are state, I would say, representatives who also carry out these functions and who report directly to the central units in Delhi. That is the primary responsibility. Now, clearly, if you look back at J&K over the last 30, 35 years, from say 1990 to 2025, and look at the punctuation of the abrogation in 2019, I think the political police civil society interface is something that has to be looked at very, very objectively. Because the elected leader, the political representative, is in a way, he or she knows the pulse of the people. And it is through them that you come into the equivalent of the state legislature. And they, in turn, are in touch with the local police in terms of governance, the local intelligence agencies, and civil society leaders. The army should come into my mind at a much later date. But regrettably, and let me emphasize this, regrettably, because we have not had that kind of a texture, that kind of an integrity in terms of the political establishment, the state police, the bureaucracy, and civil society, there have been gaps. There's been a
Right.
lack of trust. And we've had a number of cases of what you call as the overground worker, that domestic elements who are citizens of India have also
Yeah.
picked up the gun. And they have acted in a manner that is detrimental to the larger Indian security interest. That is where the
Yeah.
political process has to take the responsibility. So I think the army in particular in J&K has a limited role. You can give the army a task and say neutralize the following elements because they have carried out a terrorist attack.
Yeah.
But the primary onus of intelligence gathering and ensuring that the inputs to the rest of the matrix of governance are satisfactory should rest with the political establishment and with the local police.
You mean
And
the regional political establishment, the state establishment. I
as
think that's a
also
very valid point.
Kashmir is now under president's rule. So
Yeah.
along with the state, whoever the center has sent has to accept that responsibility. So I think the review of Pahalgam, apart from the intelligence lapses, should also look into this larger issue about what have been the failures in terms of the political leadership, both in Delhi as also
Okay.
in Srinagar, in terms of how this whole thing has, in a way, unfolded from the time that the first intelligence reports came in, which suggested that tourists will be targeted. So I think we
Right.
need that kind of a very candid accountability exercise.
Yeah, I think
And
you raised a very important point, particularly about the local police and their responsibility, which I don't think, is being touched upon. And the way you explain the entire context makes it extremely convincing that this is probably the best way to go about it. And yes, of course, a strong message has to be sent to Pakistan, but within us, here, the idea of looking within and fixing those gaps, which you so beautifully explained. Thank you so much, Commodore Uday Bhaskar, for joining us this evening, for sharing your thoughts. And we will, of course, try and encapsulate all the important points that you made today. We will be putting it out separately as well. Thanks to all the viewers watching us. Thanks very much. Have a nice evening, Commodore Bhaskar.
thank you.
Thank you. Well, we continue our coverage on all that is coming in on the Pahalgam attack and the assessment that is now on over what sort of military preparedness India has, what are the options, the retaliatory options that India has. A number of reports that we've already put out, which you can check on our Free Press Journal YouTube handle. You will find our reporter on ground as well, talking to the Kashmiri people, talking to the tourists. So we have a number of ground reports on that as well. I leave you with this report as I sign off from this discussion. And of course, a number of inputs coming in from various leaders as well after today's meeting that Prime Minister had with the Chief of Defence Staff and with the Air Force Chief and the Naval Chief. Thanks very much.
बची खुची जमीन को भी मिट्टी में मिलाने का समय आ गया है।
जो सीज फायर उल्लंघन पाकिस्तान ने किया, हमारी सेना ने उसका डटकर जवाब दिया है, मुंह तोड़ जवाब दिया है। पाकिस्तान की ओर से रजौरी, पुंछ, नौशहरा, अखनूर और कुपवाड़ा के LoC के इलाकों में सीज फायर का उल्लंघन बार बार किया जा रहा है। भारतीय सेना ने पाकिस्तान द्वारा LoC के ऊपर या इंटरनेशनल बॉर्डर पर जो सीज फायर उल्लंघन पाकिस्तान ने किया, हमारी सेना ने उसका डटकर जवाब दिया है, मुंह तोड़ जवाब दिया है। और ऐसी भी जानकारी आ रही है कि पाकिस्तान की ओर से इस नाफरमानी का जो सेना ने जवाब दिया है, उसका भारी नुकसान पाकिस्तान की सेना को उठाना पड़ा है। पुंछ और रजौरी के LoC के पार पाकिस्तान के कब्जे वाले जम्मू कश्मीर में पाकिस्तान की सेना की पोस्टों को भारी नुकसान पहुंचा है, ऐसी जानकारी प्राप्त हो रही है। हमारी सेना, हमारी पुलिस, पैरामिलिट्री फोर्सेस, BSF और जम्मू कश्मीर के लोग पूरे तरीके से तैयार हैं पाकिस्तान की नापाक हरकतों, इन साजिशों का मुकाबला करने के लिए। और पाकिस्तान ने जो पहलगाम में नाफरमानी की है, वो बर्दाश्त से बाहर है। लोगों का सब्र का बांध टूट चुका है। बॉर्डर के एरिया के लोग रजौरी, पुंछ, नौशहरा, सुंदरबनी, उड़ी, कुपवाड़ा, करना, टंगढार, लोलाब, मच्छल, केरन, गुरेज, इस बॉर्डर के लोग पूरे तरीके से सेना के साथ कंधे से कंधा मिलाकर खड़े हैं।